This is Inside the Commission, a Gambling Commission podcast. Welcome to Inside the Commission, a podcast all about gambling in Great Britain. Here we'll cover all the latest topics and trends from across the gambling sector and discuss the big issues that matter to you. From consumer queries to industry insights, we'll bring you the facts from the front line of regulation and share the stats and stories from those in the know. For all the latest discussions and updates, you can subscribe to our Gambling Commission YouTube channel, or you can find us on your preferred platform, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Harun. Today we're shining a spotlight on an issue that comes up regularly in correspondence with the Commission: fairness and transparency in gambling. Joining me is a very special guest, Andrew Rhodes, Chief Executive of the Gambling Commission. Andrew leads the way in regulating the gambling industry in Great Britain, making sure it operates in a way that is fair, safe and crime-free. In this episode, we'll be looking at the fair and open licensing objective, a cornerstone of the Commission's work. How does the Gambling Commission ensure fairness? What challenges do they face in holding these standards? And what does the future hold for gambling practices? Whether you're a stakeholder in the industry, a concerned citizen, or simply curious about the inner workings of gambling regulation, this conversation promises some valuable insights. So sit back and relax, and let's dive into this important discussion with Andrew.
This is Inside the Commission, a Gambling Commission podcast.
Hi Andrew, welcome to the show. I know you're a very busy man, you've got a lot of different things going on, you're always spinning different plates. So you've taken the time out today to come and talk to us. Before we get into talking about our topic today around the fair and open licensing objective, tell us a bit about yourself, what your role is, especially for our listeners who maybe haven't come across you before.
I'm Chief Executive of the Gambling Commission. So we regulate all forms of gambling in Great Britain, not in Northern Ireland. And that's everything from land-based casinos, bingo, the National Lottery, online betting, land-based betting, everything you think of, really. Society lotteries, the whole lot. There's only one thing that we don't do in the gambling space, which is spread betting. Yeah. But, everything else is done by us. So it's pretty busy. It's the largest regulated online gambling industry in the world, I think, by stats. Which, when you consider that Britain is not the biggest country in the world, that tells you something about how big an industry it is here. I think I've seen figures suggesting it's about the same size as the agriculture industry. When you think of the number of different people involved in that, it gives you some sense of scale of what we do. And my job is to run the commission, which effectively does a basic number of things. We issue licenses to operators for them to offer gambling. We then check that they're compliant with those licenses, and if they're not, we have to take action on that. But generally, we're here to make sure the system operates.
Yeah, and you've been with the Commission a number of years now, and you've dabbled in a lot of stuff. You try to bring the industry forward and regulate in a better way. Do you think what do you think you've achieved over those last few years? What are you most proud of?
I think other people will judge whether I've achieved anything, and you'll always have your critics in this job, and there are quite a lot of them. I've been here 3.5, well, probably more than that now. It'll be 4 years later this year, but over 3.5 years now. I do have a bit of a philosophy that if what you want is good compliance and good standards, then you have to have a productive relationship with the industry you regulate. That doesn't mean that you're going to be a pushover. It doesn't mean that you're going to agree with everything. And actually, there's been, in my tenure, more enforcement action than at any time in the history of gambling regulation in this country. And at that time, it was the vast majority of all enforcement action in gambling regulation in the world. That is a factor of the level of what we needed to do. It doesn't look like that now. I think the industry has moved on a lot. I think we do have generally constructive relationships, but I think there are a series of different camps. So you've got people who are very concerned about gambling and concerned about gambling harms, may have been affected themselves. They may have had someone close to them who's been really badly affected, so they're very concerned. There are others who I would describe as being very pro-gambling. It's a big part of their life. It's important to them. They don't want to see it interfered with. So they actually have very strong negative views about a range of people, including actually the gambling industry itself, because they think it frustrates them and should be made to take their bets and things like that. And that doesn't always work commercially. You've got the industry itself, which obviously got very strong commercial interests. It is a big taxpayer. If you look at the top, well, apparently, so I've read anyway, I think in the top 4 or 5 individual taxpayers in Britain, I think 2 of them are actually the head of gambling operators. So and that's just personal tax, right, without everything else. In terms of what am I proudest of? I don't know. I probably would only think about that, when my time here is gone, which is hopefully not too soon. But you never know, do you?
We're not announcing anything today, right?
We're definitely not. Well, or anytime soon, I hope. But I think we're in a very different position in terms of our general engagement with the industry. I think with media as well. I think it's hard to do. You get a lot of criticism, and there's some things that we've done together where we've tried different things, and we've done it because we think it's important to engage, even with people that disagree with you. In fact, especially with people that disagree with you. And I think we're a more open organisation now. I think we communicate more, we engage more. Not everybody likes it. It's not always enjoyable. But I think there is an obligation, if you're in a role like this, to do as much of that as you reasonably can. But you have to accept that not everybody is going to agree with everything you say, and some will just look for reasons to disagree, and you shouldn't dwell too much on that, I don't think.
Well, today we're going to talk about one of our core licensing objectives, which is fair and open. What does that mean when, if you're explaining that to someone, we're trying to make the industry fair and open? What are we trying to actually achieve there?
I think that's quite hard to answer, because there are 3 licensing objectives that come from the Gambling Act, which was laid in 2005, will have been written in the years before that. So it's now, the Act itself is 20 years old. It's actually older than that, really. And it comes from a time when, back then, this was pretty much nearly all a land-based industry. So it was not what we're talking about now. It's obviously, the land-based industry is still huge. But back then, we only regulated a very small percentage of online gambling. Even when online gambling got bigger, it was another decade or more or so before we regulated the whole of the online industry. So those 3 objectives, so protecting children and the vulnerable from harm and exploitation from gambling, keeping crime out of gambling, and then a fair and open objective, gambling is fair and open, stems from a much older time, and they're not hugely specific in terms of what they mean. And that's not unusual in the drafting of some legislation. But what we really mean is the fair bit, I think, is slightly more obvious. So the terms and conditions that people have are clear to them. They're not there to deceive them. They're not manifestly unfair.
Every bet is a contract.
Every bet's a contract. And you're gambling, right? I read a sentence the other day that your cognitive defences are alerted when you realise you're dealing with certain things. You know you're gambling. You know there's a risk involved. You've heard sayings like the house always wins, those sort of things. But it shouldn't be that the terms and conditions are unfair to you, that you can't win, or you're being deceived about your chances of winning, that you are being manipulated in some way. And that's essentially what we mean by fair. Now, open is a little bit harder because different people interpret that in different ways. So I've sat down with some groups who think open means they have a right to bet. Now, government doesn't want to frustrate people's ability to engage in something they want to. But actually, under consumer law, you don't have a right to bet. You don't have a right to go to Tesco. You don't have a right to have a phone line, necessarily. There are some things in life where you can't be prevented having them for very good reasons, like water, for example. But otherwise, a business can refuse your business. So it's not about that. It is, though, about the industry being open with consumers about what they're engaging in, what it means, what it is, that they have sufficient understanding of what they're being involved in. Now, we do, through the Act, have what we call the obligation to aim to permit gambling. Now, that's a really complicated and boring set of sentences, but basic, I won't reiterate them all. But essentially, providing it's reasonably in line with the licensing objectives, we have an obligation to aim to permit gambling, and that's because the Act was a liberalising Act. So, in doing that, what the government at the time, and no government has ever changed this in the 20-odd years since, wanted to make sure that people effectively weren't being diddled beyond the natural risks of gambling. So you know what the odds are, so you know what the probability is of you succeeding. If you are playing an online casino game, slots, you can find out what the return to play ratio is. You can see what's going on. You're not being misled. Now, that for lots and lots of people can mean different things, and this is where it gets way more complicated, where people start to think, well, it should mean this and it should mean that. And regulation never really keeps pace with what individual expectations might be.
Okay. And I suppose we can look at it from many different lenses, right? You can look at it from the industry lens, are we fair and open? Consumers will look at it from a consumer lens, what do they feel about the industry? Is it fair? Is it open? And then we look at it from the regulatory perspective, are we making sure it is fair and open? And they all have very different views and takes on it. The industry, we're like, well, we are fair and we are open and everything is above board. Consumers, we've seen some research, we've done some research around trust, and trust comes up quite a bit, and we've all come on to some of the issues that they come up with. And then what's our view on that? Do we feel there's a level playing field? Do we feel it's fair, it's open, and are there areas that we think there's a bit of work to do?
And there are areas there's a bit of work to do. So we've recently done a really big piece of work, effectively a strategic assessment of fair and open. And it's covering issues like withdrawals. So withdrawals is the most complained about thing to the Commission. Now, the Commission's not an ombudsman, so we don't get involved, and it's one of the big frustrations that people have with the Commission, is we don't get involved in resolving individual cases. But we do have a role around, well, hang on, how's the overall system operating? So are people being unfairly hindered when they want to withdraw their money? And we know over 99% of withdrawals happen very, very swiftly. And in probably the last 2 years, 18 months or so, most operators have moved over to the fastest payment methods. So most withdrawals are happening within, a small number of hours. But at the same time, you have got people who are multi-accounting, who might be engaged in using different identities, who might be engaged in a whole range of things which operators have got a right to protect themselves against. Our concern, and my concern, is there are consumers trapped in the middle of that who aren't doing any of those things but might be being frustrated. And there are lots of different complicated things going on. Operators want to have a really, really easy onboarding process. The more friction you have at the start of onboarding a customer in any industry, frankly, the less likely you are to land them. So there is a trade-off between low friction at the point of entry and then you wanting to introduce friction later on when you should have done this already. And that is one of the things we made really clear. You shouldn't be asking for things at the back end of the process that you could and should have asked for earlier on. Those issues, I think, are really complicated. I think it's far, far more adversarial now in the last few years than it used to be. But I don't think that's particular to gambling. I think consumer expectations have shifted over the years, and people are far more vocal. You have to be careful about what you see on social media, though. And I think it's worth touching on that a bit, because some of what you see when we dig into it, and you know this, right? I'm a real anorak about it. I find the industry fascinating. I really enjoy this job. I find it all really interesting, and I do look at what people are saying and what's going on, and you'll see these cases highlighted, about it's not fair, the operator's behaving illegally, etc. And we always take that sort of thing seriously, but quite often when you dig into the cases, they're not what's presented, so they don't indicate what people say they do. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues, though, that we've got to work on, and that's what the recent assessment's about. But I feel like in the 3.5 years or so I've been here, I feel like the pendulum of what people talk about most has moved a bit. And maybe it's not a pendulum, because I think there's more than two elements to it. Whereas I felt in the first year or so, most of the dialogue publicly was about gambling-related harm. That's not to say it isn't now, or it shouldn't be, but I feel like there is more dialogue now about consumer detriment, not in the harm space, but in fairness, terms and conditions, friction, being asked for information, being impeded in some way. And there is quite a lot of confusion around that. I don't think operators are always really clear about why they're doing things. And I think there is a job for us in trying to clear up some of that, which isn't easy to do because each case is quite different.
This is Inside the Commission, a Gambling Commission podcast. Thank you for listening to part 1 of our episode on the fair and open licensing objective with our Chief Executive, Andrew Rhodes. To stay up to date with the latest content, you can subscribe to our Gambling Commission YouTube channel, or you can find us on your preferred platform, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks for listening.